I never thought that an unexpected meeting could change my perception of a person so much. I would never have imagined that I would find myself alone with my father-in-law, Giovanni. He had always been a reserved and distant man. I'd never seen him really smile. His face was always a mask of seriousness, as if every emotion had been held back behind an impenetrable wall, and the idea of spending an entire afternoon with him made me genuinely uncomfortable. I wondered what we could possibly say to each other, whether the silence would be too much to bear, whether it would end up being an awkward and tense encounter. But that day, by a quirk of fate, it inevitably happened. If you want to know what happened that day and how one simple afternoon changed everything, subscribe to the channel. Alessandro, my husband, was out of town for work, and I had offered to deliver an urgent document to his father. Upon entering his house, a sense of anxiety and annoyance enveloped me. The house was large, cold, full of memories of a life that wasn't mine, a museum of times gone by. When Giovanni opened the door, his gaze, as always, was elusive, almost as if he wanted to avoid any direct contact. Her slightly hunched shoulders and flat tone of voice gave the impression of someone used to being alone, keeping others at a distance. We exchanged a few casual words as I handed him the document, and I could sense a subtle tension in the air, as if we were both aware of our mutual reluctance to be there. Then, just as I was about to leave, the sky broke in a sudden torrential rain. The drops came down furiously, drumming on the roof like an impetuous chorus, transforming the situation into a sort of inevitable trap. "You better stay here until it stops," he said, in a low, quiet voice. There was something inevitable about that proposal, something I couldn't refuse. I sat on the living room couch, trying to look comfortable, as I watched the rain run down the glass. The sound of the rain pattering against the window had its own hypnotic, almost relaxing melody. Giovanni sat down in front of me, maintaining the usual distance. We talked a bit about this and that, the time, the work, but it was clear that we were both uncomfortable. After a while, the silence became heavy. "So how are you, Sophia?" Giovanni finally asked, breaking the ice. There was something different in his voice, a hint of interest that I had never detected before. I replied with a formal phrase, but he didn't stop. He kept asking me about my job, my dreams, my ambitions. For the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. As the minutes passed, I realized that the discomfort was melting, slowly but surely, like snow in the sun. I was starting to relax, almost without realizing it, as every little detail in the room seemed to become less threatening and more familiar. I realized that I really knew nothing about Giovanni, that behind those apparently cold eyes, there was a world that I had never explored. His words began to reveal fragments of a life lived intensely, and I began to feel the desire to know more, to discover who that mysterious man really was. He started telling me about his youth, about traveling around Europe in an old van looking for adventure. He had been a rebellious young man, full of dreams and plans. He told me about his wife, their love story, his loss, and how everything had changed after her. "I never would have guessed," I said sincerely. Giovanni looked at me and for the first time smiled, a real, sincere smile. "No one imagines me like that anymore," he replied. "But there's more than meets the eye, Sophia." Those words left me with a strange sensation, a growing curiosity to know more about that man who until that moment had only been Alessandro's father. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the sky was growing darker and darker. Giovanni suggested making some hot tea, and I accepted with a smile. We moved to the kitchen, and I started helping him get cups and cutlery. As he poured boiling water, he told me about his love for cooking. "You know, cooking relaxes me," he said. "It's like therapy for me." I don't know what made me do it, but I started telling him about my dreams of opening a small restaurant. He listened to me carefully, without interrupting me, and for the first time I felt truly understood. "You have talent, Sophia. You should follow your dream," he said. Those words, coming from him, affected me more than I had expected. There was something deeply reassuring in the way he looked at me, as if he could see a hidden potential in my eyes, a fire that even I wasn't aware I had. His eyes conveyed an understanding that went beyond words, as if he could read between the folds of my soul, recognizing my insecurities but also my strengths. That moment made me feel seen, truly seen for the first time in a long time. Time passed and the storm continued unabated. It was clear that the rain wasn't going to stop anytime soon. Giovanni invited me to stay for dinner. I accepted more out of politeness than anything else, but the curiosity to get to know him better grew inside me. We prepared dinner together, and every gesture, every word, seemed to melt some of that ice that had always separated our lives. During dinner, the conversation became more intimate. Giovanni told me about his broken dreams, bad choices, and missed opportunities. The man behind the father-in-law's mask, that usually distant and impenetrable face, was finally showing cracks. It was strange, almost destabilizing. At a certain point, without being able to contain myself, I said to him, "It feels like I'm meeting you for the first time." He smiled, that smile that was slowly starting to become familiar, a mixture of sweetness and reserve. "Maybe so," he replied simply. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Giovanni lit the fireplace, and the warm light of the flames began to dance on the walls. The shadows seemed to tell a story of their own, creating an intimate and relaxed atmosphere. I surprised myself by feeling at ease, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I realized how little I knew Giovanni, but also how much I wanted to bridge that gap. I wanted to know every facet of him, every story hidden behind those deep eyes. Every word he said seemed to reveal a new side of him, and I couldn't help but want to know more, to immerse myself further into his life. He started telling me about his youthful adventures, about the trips he took with little money and a great desire to discover the world, about his little follies that had taken him to unexpected places amidst laughter and danger. Each story was imbued with a sense of freedom that fascinated me. There were nights spent under the stars, in unknown places, and days spent chasing dreams that seemed impossible. There was something poetic in the way he spoke, in the way his eyes shone as he described those moments. Then, without warning, he looked at me with an intensity that made me hold my breath. Have you ever seen someone in a completely different light and discovered something you never expected? Write it in the comments. "Sophia," he said, his voice deep, almost whispery, as if those words were meant only for me. "You are much more than I thought. You are interesting, strong, and beautiful." Those words hit me like lightning. His words were not just a superficial compliment. They had a weight, a meaning that went beyond. It was like he was seeing parts of me that I had never really understood myself. I didn't know what to answer. My heart started beating faster, and I felt a strange excitement growing inside me. It was as if in that moment I was seeing a version of myself I didn't know, reflected in his eyes. It was an overwhelming feeling, a mixture of fear and desire, as if I was about to discover something new about myself. I laughed nervously, a broken laugh that betrayed the agitation I felt inside. "John, I don't know what to say," I admitted, searching for the right words, but everything seemed inadequate. He shrugged with a sweet, almost embarrassed smile. "You don't have to say anything, Sophia. Sometimes words aren't necessary." The silence that followed those words was not heavy, but rather a bridge between us, something that brought us even closer. There was something in his voice, a warm and reassuring tone, that made me feel protected, yet vulnerable at the same time. It was as if his words were taking away all my defenses, leaving me naked in front of him, yet I wasn't afraid. We continued talking, and the conversation took on a smoother, more natural pace. He told me how he met his wife, the adventures they had together, and the difficulties they had faced. Every detail of their stories made me feel part of something bigger, as if I was exploring a world that had until then been closed to me. As he spoke, I felt a knot form in my stomach. There was a strange intimacy between us, a bond I had never felt before, something that united us in an unexpected way. I felt the weight of his experience, of his life, and the responsibility of being there, in that moment, to share all this with him. I was aware of the risk I was taking, of that dangerous connection that was growing between us. But despite everything, I couldn't stop. There was a charm, an irresistible appeal in those shared moments, as if every word, every look, brought us closer and closer, breaking down walls that I didn't think could be broken down. The flames in the fireplace continued to dance, and our emotions also danced with them, intertwining and confusing. Every gesture, every sigh, seemed loaded with meaning, as if we were on the verge of something irremediably important, something that could change the way we saw ourselves forever. Hours passed, but time seemed to stand still. I felt lost in that connection, in that closeness that I had never felt before. Every word of John was like a key that opened a new door in my heart, and I wondered how far that road would take me. I knew there was a thin line between what was right and what I wanted, but in that moment every line seemed to dissolve, leaving me with only the reality of the here and now, with him, with that feeling of belonging to something deeper. Eventually, we found ourselves in silence, both lost in our thoughts. I curled up on the couch, feeling the tiredness of the day, but also a peace I had never felt before. Giovanni looked at me, and without saying anything stretched out a hand towards me, as if wanting to bridge the remaining distance. I took his hand in mine, and in that moment I knew that no matter what happened from here on out, that night would remain imprinted in our hearts. It was a silent promise, a beginning that didn't need words, just us, there, together, in front of that fire that was slowly dying out. The hours passed while the rain continued to beat on the windows with the same force as before, as if to mark every second of that surreal evening. My mind was a turmoil of conflicting emotions. I felt confused, but at the same time strangely excited. Every time our eyes met, a spark passed between us, a flame I knew I couldn't ignore. It was as if an invisible force was pushing me closer and closer to him, towards a territory that I knew was dangerous, but which at the same time exercised an irresistible temptation. I felt my breathing become more labored, almost as if each heartbeat pushed me beyond a boundary I had never been ready to overcome. Every fiber of my being seemed to scream for me to stop, as my heart beat to a different rhythm, a rhythm of curiosity and desire, as if everything right and wrong were melding together, dissolving in the electricity of that moment. Emotions overlapped inside me, a vortex that dragged me towards the unknown, and it was precisely that promise of something forbidden, something mysterious that made everything so magnetic, so impossible to ignore. At a certain point, he broke the silence, suggesting we play some music. I nodded with a certain haste, eager to break that silence full of tension and unspoken questions. He chose an old jazz vinyl, and the soft, warm notes filled the room, enveloping us in a sort of timeless bubble. "It reminds me of my younger years," he said, smiling with a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. "Were you a music fan?" I asked, trying to take my mind off what was happening between us. "Oh, yes," he replied with a wistful note. "There was a time when I played the guitar, but that's a long time ago." His words seemed to be lost in the air as he looked at me with eyes full of memories. Then, without warning, he asked me, "Would you like to dance?" I remained silent for a moment, surprised by the proposal. Dancing with my father-in-law? The idea seemed crazy, yet there was something so fascinating, almost forbidden, about that request. Why not? I finally thought, letting an uncertain smile appear on my face. He took my hand with a delicacy I didn't expect, as if he was afraid of breaking something fragile between us. I stood up, and he pulled me closer to him, his arms resting around me with a confidence that made me feel protected and, at the same time, vulnerable. We began to move slowly to the beat of the music, our steps blending with the notes of jazz that filled the air. I felt his warm breath near my face, each exhalation seeming to blend with the air I breathed, filling my lungs with a strange excitement. His hand slid across my back with a delicate touch, but capable of sending a shiver down my spine, as if he were caressing my own thoughts. My heart began to beat faster, as if it wanted to free itself from my chest, each beat a drumbeat that resonated in the silence of the room. I felt the heat of his body radiating towards me. Every millimeter of distance between us seemed to shorten, and with it grew the uncontrollable desire to merge, to let go of that tension that became more impossible to ignore every moment. The distance between us closed with each step, and the electricity in the air was palpable, as if any movement could break a precarious balance. His hands were firm, sure, the pressure on my back gentle, but at the same time with an unsettling hint of possession. I couldn't stop looking into his eyes, and he stared back at me with an intensity that made me feel naked, exposed, as if he saw every thought hidden deep in my soul. Then, before I knew it, his face came closer to mine. "Sophia," he whispered, and the sound of my name on his lips had something different, more intimate, more desired. I didn't have time to respond, stop him, or humor him, because in that instant his lips touched mine. A light kiss, almost a touch, but enough to trigger something inside me, as if a door had suddenly opened, letting out everything I had tried to hold back. I drew back, confused. My breathing labored, as my heart seemed to explode in my chest. "John, we can't," I stammered, feeling my lips tremble. He interrupted me, moving closer again, his voice low, almost a whisper that resonated in the intimacy of the room. "I know, Sophia. I know it's wrong, but I can't ignore it. Not after what I heard tonight." His eyes were bright, filled with a vulnerability I had never seen before. His words were like a secret spoken for the first time, a feeling that no one should ever know, and yet now it was there, between us, naked and real, full of emotion. I felt the heat from his body radiating towards me, and the weight of those words left me defenseless, as if every barrier had been broken down in a single instant. The intensity of that moment hit me in the chest, a tension that kept me suspended between reason and desire, unable to move, unable to decide. I felt torn between the desire to escape and the desire to stay there, in his arms, letting myself go to that moment that seemed so wrong yet so right. I took a step back, trying to put distance between us. "It's not fair," I muttered, my voice barely a breath. "Not for Philip." But inside me, a darker voice whispered that it was precisely that transgression that made everything more intense, more true, as if reality had finally freed itself from the chains of conventions and expectations. We were there, suspended in a limbo of silences and unspoken confessions, while outside the rain continued to beat on the windows. Every drop seemed to punctuate our breathing, like a distant echo of the storm that was raging in our hearts. The soft lights of the room made the atmosphere even more intimate, almost unreal, and the constant pattering of the rain seemed to amplify every beat of my heart, every repressed emotion. I felt the weight of unspoken words, full of meaning, suspended between us like a thin thread that threatened to break at any moment. Every second that passed seemed to lengthen that moment, making it eternal, while my body was caught between the desire to act and the fear of the consequences. The uncertainty, the desire, the fear, everything mixed together, and the storm outside was nothing compared to what I felt inside me. I have never been so close to anyone, and no one has ever said anything like this to me. Giovanni had opened up to me in a way that left me breathless. It was wrong, I knew, but it was also real, raw, like a naked truth that I could no longer ignore. I knew I had to leave, but my legs felt glued to the floor, as if the force of his words had me rooted there, unable to move. Giovanni approached slowly, each step measured, as if he feared I might escape. She looked me in the eyes and said in a firm yet gentle voice, "Sophia, I'm not asking you anything. I just want you to know how I feel. I can't keep hiding how I feel anymore." His words made me feel confused, but at the same time touched by his sincerity. There was something so pure in that moment, something that seemed to want to pierce the defenses I had built around my heart. I could feel my heartbeat racing, each beat reminding me of how vulnerable I was. "Giovanni, I began, but he raised a finger delicately to my lips. "Shh, you don't have to say anything, just listen to me." And so I did. I listened as he told me about emotions he had never felt before, about a connection he didn't expect to find. Every word was a whisper that crept inside me, dissolving my doubts. "It's not just attraction, Sophia. It's something much deeper." His words resonated within me, leaving me trapped, as if I were imprisoned between fear and desire. Part of me wanted to run away, to leave everything behind, but another part was curious, eager to explore this new connection, this bond that I had never considered possible. I saw an authentic need in his eyes, a vulnerability that made him even more human, even closer. "John, this is too complicated," I finally said, trying to rationalize the situation. He nodded, but that spark of hope still shone in his eyes, like a light lit in the darkness of a starless night. "I know," he replied, "but sometimes the most beautiful things are also the most complicated." His voice was full of tenderness that touched my heart, melting my resistance. I didn't know what to do. I felt overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. All I could say was, "I have to go." I broke eye contact and turned to walk away, my heart screaming as my feet moved. "Maybe it's for the best," he replied, although his voice betrayed a note of disappointment that hurt. I walked towards the door, each step feeling heavy as lead, but something made me turn, look at him one last time. I couldn't understand what I wanted either. "It didn't end there, did it?" I asked, in a small voice that trembled like a leaf in the wind. Giovanni looked at me intensely, his eyes burning like embers under the ashes. "This is all up to you," he said, his voice a whisper full of promise and uncertainty. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a feeling of uncertainty mixed with excitement. It was as if I was teetering on a precipice. The emptiness beneath me was frightening, yet seductive at the same time. I didn't know if I wanted to jump or retreat. "Maybe we should forget about this evening," I suggested, but as I said it, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Giovanni approached once again, stopping a few centimeters from me. His breath was warm on my skin. His closeness made me dizzy. "I can't forget," he whispered, and there was a certainty in his eyes that took my breath away. "And I don't think you can either." And in that moment I understood that he was right. It wouldn't be easy to put aside what had happened that night, that spark that had erupted between us, a fire that now burned, slow but steady. I returned home with a heavy heart and a confused mind. I told myself that I could forget everything, that a little time was enough to get over what had happened. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt the warmth of his hand on my back, his gentle yet powerful touch. I knew that no matter what I decided to do, nothing would ever be the same. Every breath, every heartbeat reminded me of his presence, as if a part of him remained with me, attached to my soul. That night I dreamed of Giovanni. It wasn't a normal dream. It was rather a reflection of all the feelings I had tried to repress. I woke up with my heart beating wildly, my body still filled with that tension I had felt in the dream. Aware that I was about to face a decision that would change everything, I felt a mixture of fear and hope. Perhaps it was just the beginning of something much more complex and dangerous. And for the first time, I didn't know if this scared me or excited me more. I felt like a leaf being blown by a strong wind, unable to stop, but also eager to see where it would take me. And as dawn began to paint the sky pink and gold, I realized that despite everything, a part of me couldn't wait to find out. If you want to receive new videos of the series, write "I want the sequel" in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to receive a preview of the next publications. Thanks.